Whilst studying naval history does require a certain degree of chemical knowledge and understanding chemistry, I have to say there are very few times that you actually look at things and go, okay, I'm going to need to brush up on my chemistry knowledge before I do this. I'm going to need to do some research and remember these things, because the Kuznetsov class are famous, or at least one of their members, for being a belching cauldron of smoke on many occasions. And this means that I knew whatever video I did on the class, I was going to have to address this. And frankly, because I know some people literally watch the first 60 seconds of a video, and if you haven't addressed the key to that thing they're looking for, then they then write a massive sweary spiel complaining about this matter. It's a 2-hour long video normally, or an hour and a half long video. You really think I'm going to cover everything in the first 60 seconds? That would be a physical impossibility. But I thought for this one, I would talk about smoking the Mazut, because we need to understand. This is very, very old technology. I mean, Mazut is some of the worst environmental fuel you can have. It is residual. Okay, so when you're distilling fuel, when you're distilling oil into its various petrochemicals and things you can get of it, Mazut is what's left behind. It's like fuel oil. It's what's left behind. If you consider when we are talking about most of the UK fuel oils, in the UK we have C1 to H, pretty much, which go down the different fuel options. There are various standards in America, various standards around the world, different sort of fuel oils. Usually, we'll be talking in NATO terms. We'll be talking about bunkers A, B, and C. That often comes up in NATO specifications, where number 4 oil is probably the finest that a ship will ever get, if it's very lucky. It might, if it's very lucky, it might be, if they're trying to be very nice to it, actually give it something slightly better than that, but you never know. Life tends to not be so kind to ships. They tend to get what they're given and have to live with it. Number 3 is the marine diesel. So if you're a diesel ship, that's what you're getting. Number 2 of the table of fuel oils is road diesel. But heavy fuel oil, you're talking bunker A, B, and C. And for B and C, or number 5 and 6, they are residual. They are the closest to which most NATO and Western nations who use those sort of fuels will actually use. Mazut, how do I put this? Mazut is even heavier than that. Mazut requires extensive warming. Mazut requires all sorts of things to get it to burn properly, to actually get it into a liquid state that you can properly combust it. And by the way, the smoke and the heavy smoke that it's having is usually when the fuel isn't being warmed properly before it goes into the burners. So that is, as a rule, is a sign there is a problem going on in the engine room. It's always interesting whenever it comes out, because the Russians produce various points of going, oh, it's because the oil hasn't been warmed properly. Literally, stage 1 of the engine process and a lot of the engineering compartment is devoted to making sure the Mazut is warm. If that is not working, then there are other things going wrong, because there are multiple systems involved to make that work. It's kind of like saying, oh, yeah, the reason my car's lopsided is one of the wheels is missing. You've made it sound like it's such a basic thing, but actually, wheel missing, pretty crucial on most cars. Pretty darn crucial. So yeah, Mazut. and it has a sulfur content of between 0.5 and 3.5%. Honestly, most of the stuff which seems to be used by the Russian Navy is 1 to 3.5%. It's basically the higher levels. They sometimes try and claim it's the lower stuff, but honestly, that's the more expensive grades of Mazut. And it's really terrible stuff. However, and this is the point that's worthwhile making, when we talk about ships and turning them into oil-powered ships in the late 1910s, 1920s and 30s and those sort of periods, and even well into World War II, a lot of ships were using fuel which was similar to this. Because if you consider the fractional distillation techniques we use today and how good we've got at breaking up hydrocarbons, we weren't as good at that time, which meant residual fuels were far more common and they were far cheaper. And the sheer amount of fuel you have to stick in a ship to get it to move means you go the cheapest available. Yes. The idea that warships or military vehicles in any way, shape, or form get the premium grade product is farcical. It always has been. They are bought in vast volumes at the lowest price possible. The stuff that will work. And in the case of this, it requires a fairly hefty amount of work to make it work. But there you go. Mazut. Smoking a Mazut. That is what Kuznetsov is doing here. She's smoking the Mazut. Now, this though is where things start to get kind of interesting, because one of the questions I very much wanted to answer when putting this video together was whether all three members of the Tbilisi, aka Kuznetsov class, aka so many other names for the class, actually use Mazut. Or is it just the Russian one? Now, as far as Lialang, the Type 001 and her closer sister, I think she probably still does use fuel oil, but I don't think it's Mazut. I think, honestly, she burns something slightly less viscous. And the reason I say that is because, not because China necessarily is happy to spend more money, but China has done a lot of work to improve the systems in that ship and to get as much out of its energy production and all these things as possible to make it the best starting point for their naval aviation progression to fixed-wing organic maritime naval aviation. The possibility to me of actually sticking with Mazut seems very low. And that is to an extent confirmed when we look at Type 002, the Shandong, because, well, while she does have steam turbines, and we do know that, she has been modified in all sorts of ways, and her boilers certainly seem to be a lot more efficient. And it seems to me, probably leading into she was used as a testbed for a lot of systems which are going to be used on the Fujian. And again, I don't think that's the Type 003, which is currently has been launched and is on sea trials, entering production as service at this point, roughly around now. They are probably waiting for an auspicious date. The Chinese seem to be very careful in their selection of dates, and they are very, very when their ships come into service, even more than we are. We tend to use the UK still has a possibility, has a practice of using saint days for certain key events. They have to fall on a saint day or something like that, and the Chinese have their own views on this. So I think the only one of the class which uses Mazut as it is the Kuznetsov. I think the others probably can use Mazut, but I don't think they're actually fueled with it. And I don't think even the Kuznetsov is fueled with much of it at the moment, because most of its crew seem to have been deployed elsewhere for ground operations, which does not seem to be a sensible use of highly skilled crew. But there again, we're talking about Russia and the Soviet Union, and those things have a history of having great, how do I put this? Great effort, not always great thought behind what they're doing. And to be fair, there are a fair number of countries you can describe as that way, but there's usually ways you can describe all countries. Ooh, tribals, battles, and daring. So, another thing before I get into everything in fuller detail, after the Mazut, well, it's shameless book plug time. For those who don't know, I am a naval historian. I am a British naval historian, an academic. And, well, the reality is that for the rest of the work I do outside of YouTube, book sales kind of matter. So, as no one else is going to pay for my book to be advertised, to the level I'm prepared to advertise it, I advertise it. There are more books coming. But thank you to everyone who's bought a copy. Thank you to everyone who's considering buying a copy. Christmas is coming up, and I guarantee any history lover in your family who has any inclination towards naval history will love this book. Still for sale, both hardback and paperback editions. Please. It's a lovely, lovely thing for buying the loved ones in your life who like history. How's that? Best car salesman smile. Ding. So, let's consider the concept of the class. The heavy aircraft carrying cruiser. Now, if you've seen my video about the Kievs and the Invincibles, the through-deck cruisers, you'll notice that immediately this is not on the through-deck cruiser category. There is a lot more flight deck space for starters. A lot more. In fact, it pretty much is entirely flight deck space. So how is this a heavy aircraft carrying cruiser? Well, the idea was they found they could tuck the missiles below the flight deck and have the aircraft take off over them. Quite literally. You might be thinking similar things to me of, hang on, didn't they put some very spicy warheads on some of their missiles? And then they had aircraft which, if things go wrong in takeoff, tend to be fiery balls of their own versions of spiciness going over them? Yes, they do. And yes, that is both probably they requiring as much engineering as you think it would require, and also has been removed by the Chinese from both of their variants. The Varag, aka Liang, which came into service, had it taken out in their refit, and the Shidong never had it in the first place. Because the level of engineering which goes in to try and make that somewhere approaching a safe concept is pretty heavy duty. Versus the fact that the space you get from removing those systems gives you an increased aircraft capacity, which is useful. So, you know, these things are as these things are. You can say perhaps it's to do with some of the treaties for them to get in and out of the Dardanelles Strait because they have to be able to show that they are a cruiser rather than an aircraft carrier. But honestly, in all practical terms, no. The reality is, as they were built, they were about the Bastion defense again. And we'll be talking about the Bastion defense and their role in that. These ships are an improved Kiev class. They are about giving you a heavier, stronger capability for defending the bastions. They're still, though, about integrating with land-based aviation. They're still, though, about being an offensive part of their strategy. And that's more of an important thing than their capability as global reach assets and global presence assets. There was an interesting discussion put in one of the videos, on one of the videos of the Kiev class, that, US and UK carriers aren't about defense as much as the Chinese or Russian carriers. that's a wrong. That's I don't. It is wrong, but it's not wrong in a nasty way. It's wrong in a. It's wrong because it's not seeing the different forms of defense. You see, the Russian and the Chinese situation is, to an extent, they do not have enough power to be able to do the best form of defense with carriers that you can do, which is to keep your enemy over there, not let them come to you. But America has the power to, has the finances and power, investment in infrastructure to be able to do that, and that's why they have the number of carriers they do. And Britain doesn't have any choice. It's an island nation which is absolutely cripplingly dependent upon sea lines and communication for everything, including its wider economy and all the things it does, because its wider economy is made on being a services industry, which means as long as the sea lines of communication are moving around the world, it can earn money from services. The moment those start to go wrong, its service economy crashes, which anyone who does any long-term study of British economics realizes very quickly. Britain's been like that for about the last 150 to 200 years in terms of economic dependency on movement of goods around the world by the sea and information communication, everything going by the sea. That's been the state of the British economy, which is why when people go, oh yes, we are a small island nation and just focus on the small island, that's not smart. And so Britain and America both operate almost sort of more offensive doctrine, but that's because they're defensive. They prefer not to have anyone get in range of attacking their nations, which is a defensive idea. They want to keep people away so they can't attack their nations. The Soviet Union basically was going on the idea of, we don't have enough force and we're not going to get enough funding compared to the army because of the humongous land borders to be able to have enough force to do that policy. What's the next best policy we can do? Stop them from getting close to the shore. Stop them from getting within key target fighting range. So bastions. And these areas will also serve as defensive positions for our ballistic missile submarines to operate in safely. Whereas the British and American ballistic missile submarines go off and hide somewhere in the middle Atlantic. Somewhere far in the Atlantic, far away from everyone, they disappear off to the middle of the Pacific, and far away from where anyone else is, they go off high. Again, the point for the Soviets and the Russians later on was that those vessels would have to get through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. They'd have to go places where they are going to get themselves picked up, where they're going to get heard, where they're going to get themselves into trouble. You don't want them doing that. You want them safe. You want them safe in an area you can protect. That's the bastions for you. Usually at this point, someone turns around and goes, but the Chinese, they don't operate on a bastion system, and they're using these carriers, so they must have different concept of operations. Well, they do, but as I'll be getting into it later, the Chinese have their own system, which is not dissimilar to the bastion system, but is not the same as the bastion system. So the concept of these ships, as they originally were to be the centerpieces of task troops, like the Kievs, but they were also to be far more aviation capable than the Kievs. They were to carry far better, far stronger aircraft. And they're a really interesting halfway point. They're STOBAR. And STOBAR means short takeoff, barrier-assisted recovery. Now, there's a really interesting fun time I had when there's going to be, mentioned in Scuttlebutt, so I'm going to be discussing a Scuttlebutt 5 or Scuttlebutt 6 is going to be discussed about the history of those designations: CATABAR, catapult assisted takeoff, barrier assisted recovery, all these things in that Scuttlebutt. So if you want more information, please go to the Scuttlebutt, which will be probably probably labeled something like aircraft questions or something like that. It'll be 5 or 6. So the changes in concept that have started off with Kuznetsov and then transitioned with Liaoning and then Shandong are very simple. Kuznetsov starts off as being about the bastions, but has become about Russia maintaining its presence on the global stage, about Russia maintaining its global power and its status, and sailing around as a visible image of the power of Russia and its ability to project itself. That's why it turned up in the Mediterranean a couple of years ago. That's why it sailed through the English Channel. That's why it did all these things, was literally to show we can do this. For the Chinese, it's also a similar thing. Carriers are as much about status as a great power as they are about your actual defense capabilities. And you always have to consider that with carriers, okay? Carriers are about as much time as about peacetime presence and the image they project as they are about their real-time capabilities. And this is again one of the things which gets me into the conversation of cost versus value. You see, it's very easy to start giving something military values in terms of warfighting capability. It's very easy to look at their cost. It's very difficult to talk about presence. It's very difficult to talk about diplomatic value, status value, because those are not hard and fast measurables. It's kind of like marketing. When we're talking about marketing for a company and the various advantages it can bring. Diplomacy is like that. Diplomacy has a lot of things which you do, which you cannot necessarily measure the response of, or the results of, but if you don't do them, you soon realize what what not doing them costs you. They're things which don't necessarily bring in something until they're absent, then they bring in a lot of bad things. And it's the same with naval diplomacy and presence and image or projection. Projecting power, projecting capability of having an aircraft carrier, having the status, being able to stand up there and go, we have a mighty fleet, this is our waters, these are our waters, this is our task group, and look at it, it's a fully functional task group with layered defenses all the way up to including organic aviation. That is a powerful statement. But it doesn't have military value until things start fighting, doesn't it? Well, it does. But again, it's stuff you cannot necessarily put in a profit or loss statement. Because how do you judge the effect of your carrier group sailing around on neutral powers? If they choose not to get into conflict, that's a good thing. But can you put it down to just your carrier group wandering around, or might they not want to? Might not be ready? Might there be other things you're doing? It's murky. You can't. But if you don't have your carrier group wandering around, and they do decide that you're frankly can't offer them any measure of protection, so there's no point in staying neutral, they might as well join the other side. And you have a problem, don't you? Carriers. They are a bit of a catch-22. Do them right, and you will never be able to measure half the benefits they bring, because you're doing it right and it's just a coincidence. It's just a incidental benefit. It's something you cannot focus in on. Do them wrong, and you will never be able to predict all the ways it's going to muck you up. And embarrass you. Because it will do. It will completely embarrass you. So let's consider also the builders. Now, there are two companies in all this. The Black Sea Shipyard of Soviet Shipyard number 444 and the Dalian Shipbuilding Industry Company. Now, I would say this, there is also a whole little story about whether or not Kuznetsov should have belonged to the Ukrainians. Because she was technically in Sevastopol when Ukraine went independent. But the deputy commander of the Northern Fleet flew south. And it's amazing, a telegram from a president of a country which has only just really appeared versus a very senior admiral sitting on your flag deck giving you orders has the level of impact those two things have. So yeah, that's how Kuznetsov came to still be in Russian service after the fall of the Soviet Union. But that also meant that her sister ship was left behind, because there was literally one yard which could build ships of this size at this point for the Russians to go with, and that, of course, is the Varag, which eventually becomes the Liang. And she's, I would say, at best a sort of, each one of them is an evolution. Kuznetsov is number one. Then you have Lilang, which is 1.5. So she's still got a lot of number one in her, but she waited for years to be finished. She was sent to the Chinese. The Chinese stripped her out and rebuilt her again, and it was the same as building like 20 destroyers. Was sometimes the complexity of the task was issued out, and they literally put a stellar team of their senior engineers on. And one of the really great things I love, I have to say, I am really proud of when I read it, because it does make your life just a tad easier, just a tad easier, is as Wikipedia actually contains the names of those who were involved in the project. This blows my mind sometimes, because the amount of ships you can read about, and you will never get any mention of their designers and architects, and you will not. But this was such a big project, and also it's a pretty cool story how the Chinese get hold of it. They do a lot of covert business deals, everything to get the Varag out, and in many ways they are taking out from the noses of not just the Russians and the Ukrainians, but pretty much everyone. Although I have to admit, and I will say this as well, there were quite a few of us who were quite suspicious at the time. You know, an aircraft carrier for a casino and a hotel. It has a lot of space, I can see why, but the accommodations on Russian carriers were never particularly brilliant. So the amount of work to make there be anything like the kind of accommodations that a casino hotel would want for its guests was an interesting figure to think about. But anyway, they list out, they've got Zhu Yingfu, Wu Yixiang, and Wang Zhou, and Yang Lei, who I have just mangled the names of terribly. I do apologize. But I was trying to pronounce, especially Wu. He's got Zhou Guang as his name, and I was sort of going, Zhou Guang? That doesn't sound right, rolling off my tongue. Doesn't. It sounds even worse, so I tried it as best I could. But they're actually listed on the Wikipedia. And that's cool. Finding decent books about them is a bit more difficult. It is truly a bit more difficult, and it's something I'm looking into. I think probably I'm going to have to start trying to cultivate a source of Chinese naval history books and translating them, like I've cultivated sources of Japanese and other nations' history books. It's certainly what I think I'm probably going to have to do. Now, that means, as far as we know about the builders on the Chinese side, is the information mostly comes from journal articles, from magazines and other articles and blogs, which a fair number have had to go through Google Translate. I can read a little bit. That's enough to be able to check the Google Translate is on the right lines, not enough to be able to translate it myself without the assistance of Google Translate. Saying that, what interested me is that in both cases, for both the builders or the building construction of these ships of this class in Soviet Union / Russia / Ukraine and China, they're stepping stones. This class was the stepping stone to what was planned to be the Ulunovsk class carrier, which was going to be Russia's first nuclear-powered supercarrier equivalent. And, as mentioned already, the Type 003 Fujian is... Well, I think some sources do actually overstate it, because whilst I'm sure is a very advanced, I'm also very sure that it's an evolutionary advance, not necessarily as advanced as it could be, because China are not in the business of putting out the latest, greatest cutting edge research at sea to see if it works. They're in the business of growing a naval aviation component at the moment. They're in the business of growing capability. The last thing they want is to put something out into the water and then it fail and be an embarrassment. So, whereas some of my peers who do analysis of current affairs, etc., are going, oh, she's the most advanced carrier in the world outside of the America, and this, that. No. I'm fairly sure, tech-wise, she's probably fairly advanced. Yes. But tech-wise, I'm reckoning she's probably still about early 2000s, 2010s. Maybe with the she's got electromagnetic catapults and those things, but those are probably the high-tech bits, and quite a lot of the rest is going to be quite reliable tech. The next class, they're going to bring everything else up to... Because that's how you do it, how you evolve ships. You don't change everything and go, we've got the greatest ship... Because that's usually when you lead to problems. Just think about recent ship construction projects where nations have decided they're not going to follow that policy. Where instead they're going to do a massive leap and everything's going to be new. One of the interesting things, the British learnt their lesson with some of the stuff from Type 42 to Type 45, which is why a lot of the later Type 23 upgrades have literally been future-proofing and testing the tech before it goes into the Type 26s. Because it's a case of, okay, so we're no longer building constant batches of ships every year, so we can't do a slow evolution. What can we do? Well, the upgrades. We can test out some portions of technology in each of the different upgrades, and so we can test it all and then bring it together. That works. What the Chinese are doing is developing a naval aviation arm. It's the same as what the Soviet Union was developing. They were developing naval aviation capability. Basically, the next generation carriers, the Ulanovsk or the Type 003, are the beginning of them developing an expeditionary naval aviation capability. Remember when I spoke about the defensive perimeters in terms of Britain, America versus the Soviet Union? Well, the Soviet Union wanted to get to the point of the America and Britain with that ability to project power to someone else's place so they don't have to fight near their own place. And China also does that. So both are projecting along that path. Now, the interesting thing about China and the Soviet Union is both use design institutes. So, in many ways, whilst the shipyards matter because they're the construction skills, what you have to track more is the design institutes in terms of who is coming in. So I can give you both the shipyards. Very nicely. Very simple, easy thing to focus on. But if we're talking about the Chinese and their carriers and their systems, we're talking about the 701st Institute, which is a very interesting organization. It's been getting more and more representation at various levels of the Chinese political structure because it's been more and more important to it as they're developing their naval capabilities. And it's really interesting to see how it's growing. How capable it is. But I will also say this. It's interesting to me to note that Diane Shipbuilding Industry Company, despite having done the first and second carriers, didn't get the third carrier. The third carrier, the Type 003, went to the Jiang'an shipyard, which has been open since 1865, and its headquarters are in Shanghai. It's part of the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, pretty much all of them are, so that really doesn't matter too much, I suppose. They're all part of the same broadly state-owned company. But the point is, I, to my view, moving this to Shanghai especially, shows they're realizing that Dalian, for all its opportunities and all its skill base there, did not often offer much space for expansion. And realistically, what the Chinese are hoping to set up is something which is going to be a large ship specialist yard that is going to be able to churn out very high quality warships at a suitable rate. And before someone starts saying, and in the comments there will always be someone saying, oh yes, that they can spam out these things whereas we can't, all these things. Actually, the more complicated the ships get, the more difficult it gets to build them, but also the more time it takes. And it doesn't matter how many skilled people you have. There's only so many people who can work in a space at a time. You can only fit things in a certain order trades-wise. You cannot fit certain things around other things in terms of the utilities, in terms of the power lines, the water piping, all those things. And the more complicated a ship gets, especially once you start adding in nuclear power and all those things, it takes time. So don't start imagining. What I'm saying here is, don't start imagining something which isn't the case. Now, this doesn't mean China couldn't do that. This doesn't mean the Soviet Union couldn't have done that. If they'd wanted to, they could by quite simply just having more yards involved, and then they can do more. But if they do go down the centre of excellence, which both the Soviet Union to an extent and the Chinese seem to be going down, the same as the West has gone down, then the timelines are probably going to end up being much the same. It's a bit of history to think about, and it's a bit of stuff to take in. But both these shipyards, well, I would say especially the Black Sea shipyard, was a critical point and a critical facility for the Soviet Union, and its loss was a big one. Sadly enough, and perhaps unsurprising with all that's been going on in that part of the world, that yard is now pretty much gone forever. So, yeah, another piece of industrial might for the world and industrial infrastructure, no more. So let's consider the fixed-wing aircraft options. Well, the Kuznetsov carries a mixed air wing, usually heavily made up of Su-33s, these aircraft, but also sometimes having MiG-29Ks, which were originally realistically put on there to test out for the Indians, who were going to be operating them from the Vikramaditya, which is the conversion of the Admiral Gorshkov, which of course is the halfway point between the Kiev class and the Kuznetsov class. And I will keep saying this, the Kuznetsov class was originally called the Tbilisi class. It goes through all sorts of different names, though, to get it to Kuznetsov, but we'll leave that to one side. In contrast, the Chinese have again, in many ways, sought to have interim aircraft until they could develop their own proper aircraft. They've been using evolutions, adaptations of existing types. To be honest, the Shenyang J-15 is an interesting amalgamation of the Shenyang J-11B, which was, it's pretty much openly acknowledged to be a Chinese modified version of the Sukhoi Su-27. Pretty much the Chinese had looked at this, studied this aircraft extensively and gone, we like it, but honestly we'd like to be A, building our own, and B, there are some things about it we'd like to change, and the Russians keep charging us an arm and a leg. What happens again with this program is that the Shenyang J-15 pretty much comes about, though, because the Chinese end up, after trying to get some Sukhoi Su-33s, they basically amalgamate their J-11 research. They study a early prototype of the Su-33 to manage to get off Ukraine, because the Soviets had left all sorts of things behind, and the Ukrainians were happy to sell pretty much any of it. And what else they obtained from other sources around the world and their own research. And I really cannot emphasize enough their own research, because one of the things that we often fall down the rabbit hole of with the Chinese, kind of like we did with the Japanese in the 20s and 30s, is presume they're copying everything. Now, this does not mean they're not copying anything, or rather they're not utilising others' research and others' work which has already been done, because that isn't necessarily wrong. If you've got information which has already been done, worked out to a high standard, you use that. You reference it. You cite it. It's a basic of academia. As long as you acknowledge where it comes from. Of course, though, when you acknowledge things as a government where they come from, it tends to involve paying large bills. So, you know, one can understand perhaps not acknowledging these things. Anyway, the J-15 is pretty much an interim aircraft, but it's been a good worker for the Chinese Navy. They've now got roughly 60 in service. Now, let me please note why I say roughly 60, because, believe it or not, this can be a hotly contested debate. It can be. The reason I say that is because Liang, the Type 001, carries up to 24. Shidong, Type 002, carries up to 32. So that's 56 already. Fujian potentially going to be fitted with them at least during its it's been at least been operating them to an extent during its testing phase and working up with them, and can also carry some. And then there's probably spare aircraft you have in stores and for long-term refit, etc. And there's your training aircraft. And very quickly you realise that 60 does not add up to enough for all these jobs. Now, the phrases could be the up tos. That could mean that both carriers are running light on them. And that is a possibility. But the Chinese so far have been doing everything along the lines of maximising their utility of these vessels so they can utilise them to bootstrap themselves to the next level of naval aviation development and naval aviation operation. To me, that does not mean that they're going to be running their air groups light, which means that either the official figures being given are bogus, I'm sorry, but kind of like with Lexington and Saratoga and their weights on the treaty limits, the maths doesn't add up, or there is a serious misunderstanding of what these the operating characteristics of these aircraft going on. So there's one or the other. As for the Russians with the Kuznetsov, frankly, we know their air group is a... We would like an air group of this size. We would like to be operating this many aircraft. It's very rare they have that many aircraft, even aboard the vessel, let alone operational. It's a far cry from what it was intended to be, where it was going to be a strike coordinator, reconnaissance asset, and an air defense asset of these bastion defense task groups. Far cry from that. Then we have the rotary wing options. Now, I should say the Chang'e Z-18 comes in multiple variants, but what you will notice is looking on them is you're going, hang on, these helicopters, there's at least two of them which are carrying large dishes below them. Could they be a form of airborne early warning? Why, yes, they could be. They could be. We'd like to pretend it's only the British who have helicopter-based airborne early warning. It's not just the British. It's any nation which is operating carriers which are less than Catabar. Catapult-assisted takeoff, barrier-assisted recovery. Any nations which are not operating at that level. And there's a reason for that. You still need airborne early warning. If the Falklands War taught us anything, if all the operations of aircraft carriers since World War II have taught us anything, it's that airborne early warning is the single most useful thing a carrier brings to the table. Because it is able to support offensive action, defensive action, task group defense, carrier defense, fighter coordination. There is literally an endless list of things it is able to do. It is basically the MVP of the game and the only one who plays the whole game. If we consider naval operations like American football. Rather than rugby, where everyone does play the whole game anyway. It's quite fun being a prop and having to tackle people. They're always so sure that there's going to be one of the fast boys who catch them, but when they get flattened by something very large and heavy, they remember it. They're also wondering how they got caught, but sometimes we are faster on our toes than we look like we are. Now, the main thing for these aircraft to do is usually anti-submarine warfare. However, there's also so much used as a version of plane guard almost when the aircraft are operating. The Harbin Z9, the second one up, is a good example of this. It often seems to be employed hovering next to the carrier when the aircraft are taking off and landing as a search and recovery asset. And to an extent, it's similar to the KMOF-27, which is the smaller one, second from the top. And that's also sometimes used in a similar way. And that's a good thing. Using a helicopter like that, perfectly sensible. Very useful to try and recover crew, because let's be honest, air crew, if they do go over the side and an aircraft which suddenly stops working or has an accident on landing or takeoff, it's almost as difficult to train and select one of them as it is to get a new aircraft these days. Let's be honest, we talk about the pipelines for delivering completed aircraft. We'll look at the pipelines for delivering qualified aircrew. Especially aircrew who are integrated and experienced. And again, these aircraft, like their fixed-wing counterparts, are about providing the carriers with a suite of capabilities. Do they have the same suite of capabilities as the Nimitz class? No. Do they displace roughly half as much as the Nimitz class? Yes. Do all of them have different displacements? Certainly. There is a reason why, after much time trying to put together, I was over the impression I was either going to have to do 3 separate vitals pages, or I was going to do one which was going to be a mess because it was going to be so much information crammed into it. And so I decided that that's going to wait for a Keyships video. It's going to literally wait for a Keyships video where it is literally talking about the engineering of the ships. Because it's going to be 3 separate slides to make it make sense. It just gets too mucky under one slide. But despite that size difference, they're still capable vessels. Not capable on the same scale, but still very capable. And that gives you the ultimate truth about aircraft carriers, realistically. There is often an idea put round that if they're not one thing, they're terrible. If they're not this, they're terrible. But the question is always, do they fit your needs? And that's where we get into the discussions of the conception of these carriers. Because in many ways, we know more about their conception, we know more about their visible operation and their diplomatic operation than we do about their day-to-day running. Let me explain that. Because when they're used, they're visible. They are the highly focused on by everyone else, what the frigate are they up to now things. For the Soviet Union, it's the Bastion defense, which I've discussed before with the Kiev class. And that certainly was a very interesting project, pretty much about making sure that the White Sea was as pure as possible for SSBN operations, and that everyone was kept well below the Faroes Gap. So basically, the idea was to try and keep the fighting between the Norway Faroes Greenland Gap and the Greenland Iceland UK Gap, so that the fighting would take place in those spaces in naval terms, rather than going closer to the Soviet Union or closer to the Ally and to NATO powers. Honestly, for China, which doesn't have the Soviet problem of having multiple oceans and snippets on all of them, but does have the problem of having one massive coastline without the benefit necessarily of it large chunks of it being covered in ice and very difficult for people to get access to. Combine that with, and this is going to get me comments from so many people, a certain rapaciousness when it comes to seas which bear their names. It might be called the South China Sea, and it might be called the East China Sea. It doesn't mean it belongs to China. It really doesn't mean it belongs to China. Exclusive economic zones are a thing, and other countries are allowed to have them as well. But we'll leave that to one side, because that's just going to get a worse debate as time goes on, and it's going to get more of a reason for aircraft carriers to be valuable, because exclusive economic zones are not something that's going away, and it looks like the way the United Nations is planning on solving some issues when it comes to exploitation of resources, but also management of maritime resources, is to expand them once again. And there is talk of it going up to as much as 400 nautical miles from 200 nautical miles. And all I can say is that is going to cause trouble. But it's also the only way to prevent a lot of other trouble. So it's basically pick your choice of trouble. China's defensive area is sometimes called the island chains. And the trouble is with the island chains is once you start looking at the first and second island chains, you notice that there are a lot of nations in those areas who are not China. We can talk about the first one, which is an intriguing one, which of course is Taiwan, which is was the Republic of China, is now usually just referred to as Taiwan, and then you've got People's Republic of China, which is China. But of course, there's the whole dispute over that. But the trouble is, once you're dealing with a nation which is functionally a sovereign nation, it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. It is incredibly difficult to put that genie back in the bottle without a large amount of military force. And whilst China keeps potentially threatening that maneuver, so far they haven't actually pulled that trigger. Although there are some points of view you can get into where they might be tightening the noose. The often discussion thing has been put forward both on here and on Bill Trump's was that the Chinese would just keep doing operations and exercises of bigger and bigger and closer and closer to Taiwan until eventually one day those exercises don't turn out to be an exercise and you're caught off guard. That is their theoretical plan. Myself, I think that will have to wait for them to have a few more carriers in service for them to really bring it in. Because again, Taiwan is kind of like Ukraine. They've had years to prepare. There are both going to be things which go to plan for the Chinese in any such operation and things which don't go to plan. That's the way war works. That's the way. It doesn't matter whether you call it special military operations or what, whatever. But if you're actually going to have the defensive depth to necessarily absorb those things which are going to go wrong, you're going to want to be able to operate out to the second island chain with some degree of operational success. And to me, that means you need things larger than Liang and Shandong to do that. Liang and Shandong will provide you with the aviation capability you need for the South China Sea and East China Sea. They will. They will be able to, within the support of the land-based air power that can reach them and the various islands, artificial reefs that have been built up, and with the air support that can come from them, etc., they are adequate to the task and can provide you with the capability you need to support your operations. Are they necessarily going to want to get into a full-on carrier battle with an American carrier or American carrier task force? No, but that's not what they're for. They're there to be a linchpin of a larger strike or force, which will probably originate from the mainland, and to help coordinate and provide sort of the forward instructions for a far wider, far heavier attack, which is going to coordinate multiple assets, because the Chinese have gone down the same route that Gorshkov took the Soviet Union down. The idea of the combined massed attack, where you're launching missiles and other weapons from multiple different units, multiple different angles, at the enemy with similar times on target, so that you overwhelm and overload the enemy's defences. It's not rocket science, it's difficult to pull off, but it's not rocket science in how it affects things, because if the ships ships are forced to spread their energies everywhere, they can't focus anywhere. And that's when you do get leakers, and leakers are what cause damage, and then damage leads to even greater attrition, because you have less ability to fight off the next wave, and next wave, and next wave, and that's what wears you down. But yes, if you want to be able to secure the scenario, the first island chain and secure that area, you're going to be able to have to push on to what's roughly called the second island chain. And it's kind of like, again, the Soviet Union with the bastions. Okay, we can secure the bastions, but can we really secure ourselves? No, we need to be able to push on further, closer to the GA-UK gap, closer to those spheres. Well, that's what the Ulyanovsk class was about, and that's what the Fujian class is about. They're about pushing onwards. They're about pushing further on. About giving yourself a defensive depth, because if you can operate in those areas, you can force your opponent to operate in those areas away from your own defensive area. That's the point. It's about dictating not just the pace, but also the location of action and combat. Being able to mount those strikes, those coordinated efforts, further away. That's what matters. And that's what they're building up towards. But China also has to deal with something which the Soviet Union didn't really have to deal with. Sea lines of communication. Now, this is where you get some very interesting perspectives, commanders. China imports roughly 80% of their crude oil via the sea from the Persian Gulf. Now, yes, they have increasing alignment with Russia. They have all sorts of trade imports going on there, but it doesn't matter realistically in this sheer volume and scale we're talking about, neither for the Chinese economy. This means this route is incredibly important. People made a big fuss a few years ago when there was all the issue going on with Somalian pirates, and the Chinese deployed a task force. And everyone going, oh, this is a shock. China's deployed a task force. Why have they done this? What are they seeking for? Simple. They're oil supplies. They're vital trade routes. Also, this is one of the issues which certain other powers in this region have as an issue. Because if you disrupt this flow, the nations which are going to be most affected are the ones to the, well, how to put this politely, to the east of you, more than the ones to the west of you, because of where they get their fuel from, and because of how dependent their economies are. So, you have India and you have China here, included in that number. Both operate aircraft carriers. Both are very concerned with these regions. Now, yes, they are currently having their own very unique dispute in the Himalayas. It's a whole thing which I won't get into here because it's far more of a build from topic than a carrier evaluation topic. People hitting each other with sticks in the middle of a mountain range. But the thing is, there's another problem for China. Because, okay, let's say it's not the Gulf that's got or piracy, but let's say the Indian government got upset with them enough to start not even stopping the oil, just delaying it, insisting on customs checks or something to do with the oil that's passing through their exclusive maritime zone, because we're searching to make sure the oil going through is legal and not from illegal sources. Technically, the Indian government could do that. Technically, they wouldn't do it at the moment because it would be a raise in the aggression and the provocation level. But technically, they can do it, and whilst technically that's not illegal for them to do, and so you can't really the only way you can really protest is to try and send your own carrier group out there to go, we are going to make sure this is being done properly by looking over it. At which point the Indians will probably deploy their own carrier group, and we'll have a couple of carrier groups wandering around the Indian Ocean, shadowboxing, as carrier groups tend to do when they are from powers who are disagreeing. Or they would hold a joint exercise and just make it an official shadowboxing match. But we'll leave that to one side. The point is, for China, the sea lines of communication are far more important than they were for the Soviet Union and for Russia, which is one of the reasons why they have accelerated on towards the next generation of carriers. Why they have accelerated through them. They haven't built a whole class of Kievs. Before that, some Moskvas. And then started on a class of Kuznetsov equivalents, and then gone to the larger fleet carriers. No, the Chinese literally have gone, one, we've got a carrier. Husk, we're going to actually get it ready. We're going to refit it and get it into service. And then two, we're going to build our own from the scratch built equivalent of that Husk. So we have something to develop ourselves on. And then three, we're going to build our next generation carrier using all the lessons we learned from the first two. And four, we've got plans for a full, massive carrier. Which, to an extent, yes, they are actually piggybacking off the Soviet Union's efforts, where they were starting from scratch and not able to go to anyone else. They weren't able to start off with anyone else's information. They weren't able to get Husk from anyone else. And the Chinese actually did buy more carriers than just the former Soviet one. They built all sorts of other vessels which were studied closely, but were used as hotels and casinos and all sorts of things officially. But ultimately, it does come down to this. It comes down to great power status. And this is pictures actually of the Kuznetsov with the former Admiral Gorskov, now the Vikramaditya, of the Indian Navy. These are nations and these are carriers which are being used increasingly. Well, the Kuznetsov was prior to the beginning of its last refit program. Were being used extensively to affirm the status of their nations. Now that can be a regional affirmation, that can be a global affirmation. It can be, we are a really strong regional power, but we want to show the world we have global capabilities, so we'll send off a carrier. It can be that you are a really very strong superpower with all these weapon systems sitting there and everyone knowing how powerful you are, but no one really believing you're that physically powerful. It's kind of like you go, well, yeah, you've got an assault rifle. You can really beat me up. But you have to escalate to the level you're going to use that. Whereas if we're just having a verbal argument and you pull out the assault rifle, you look like you're an idiot, whereas I just look like I'm being sensible when I back down. The aircraft carriers wandering around are basically the equivalent of, well, you don't look like a weak person now. You look quite well built, strong, you're suited and booted. Okay, so you're quite physically intimidating before you even bring out the assault rifle. That's the great power status. That's what China is seeking, and that's what Russia has been operating and trying to operate Kuznetsov with the idea of. But again, the thing which I think China learnt from Russia was that one carrier is no carriers. The fact is that when the carrier went for its wanders around the world, because it was such an unusual event, because it was such a, oh, look, their carrier's out, it garnered even more attention than normal, and so when there were issues, oh, frigate. That's why it gets the status it does about being... about belching smoke. Excuse me. We dying quietly? Are we okay? We okay. Just verbal. Okay. So, that's the reality. And by the way, this is the same for all my old powers with operating. Once you get below 3, you're in trouble of anything. Because even for Britain, with 2 carriers, and China, which has pretty much got 2 carriers at the moment, if the one you're going to be sending suddenly starts to develop issues, then you have to try and get the other one ready to go and send. And that might be fine, it might be available, or it might have been sitting in long-term refit. And that's a problem. It also has an issue for infrastructure-wise, because you might think, well, we have 2 of them, so we only need 1 dry dock, because we're never going to need both in that at one time. No. The thing is, when you have 6 ships, you're not going to need 6 dry docks. Sod's Law dictates, though, when you have 2, that you are going to need at least 2. Because Sod's Law is like that. So, there's a real problem with aircraft carriers and status in that when they're done right, it shows the world how powerful and how capable you are. It allows you to show yourself off. When it's done wrong, it's an embarrassment. It causes you to look silly. This is why the Fujian is quite so important, and why I kept mentioning the Fujian through this discussion. We know very little, realistically, about this vessel yet, and we will continue to know very little for a while. It's the reality of the system we are in, and of the nature of the world. What we do know about it is a step forward on this. It is finally someone delivering a next generation evolution from the Kuznetsov class, the Polisi class. And that's exciting. That is exciting. We have no idea if Russia will eventually follow on with their plans to build a replacement for the Kuznetsov. If any vessel deserves to be put out of its misery and allowed to go and have a rest, it's probably that ship. It's an incredibly complicated and capable for its original planned ideas design, which has been forced into tasks which it was not designed around, and honestly with crews who are not as capable as they were designed to be operated by. Again, people will bring up, well, during the Soviet Union it was all conscription. Yes, it was. They were conscript servicemen. But there was also a large number, especially towards the end of the Soviet Union, of specialists. A large number of an NCO form organization developing. All these things, all these technical, skilled personnel were being trained up with the idea of growing the capability of the Navy. Because the truth is, navies are incredibly technically complicated. They have lots of moving parts, and you're dealing with the firepower of several air wings, several artillery batteries, all the electronics and sensors and systems. Once you put everything together, each one of these ships is an incredibly powerful asset, incredibly potent asset, but only so long as it's used well and operated well. So normally, with these videos, I have a question at the end. And that's an interesting thing to come up with, because realistically, this class, the Kievs before them, the Moscovas before that, are about developing naval aviation, organic naval aviation, in the post-World War II environment, when you don't have a previous history of it, a prior history of it. I have a video coming up called Soviet Naval Aviation Doctrine, And that's going to look at their World War II doctrine of what they were planning on using naval aviation for. But that's the starting point. I'm also going to look at their Cold War doctrine there. Because you have to. It builds upon it. But the reality is that the Soviet Union was very much starting from almost negative knowledge when it came to aircraft carrier operations when they started putting together the Moscow and the Kievs. Because their ideas about aircraft carriers had developed into a sort of a perpetuating, self-fulfilling mythology by that point. Because not having them had been such a point of virtue of the Soviet Union. We don't need them. We don't... that they'd actually developed some really interesting misunderstandings about carrier operations. Sadly enough, those misunderstandings still seem to be prevalent, though not so longer in Russia and the former Eastern Bloc states, but more to be relevant in various sections of the news media of the Western world. But we'll leave that to one side. Mostly citing the Soviet sources. Once you realise it, because they're saying, well, I've read this book about the history of naval aviation. You go, and that book cites that source and those for that analysis, which was the Soviet sources and the Soviet historians. Yes, I know you wanted patting. Caramba, you're very demanding today. But they did. They still carried on. They still developed the stuff. And it kind of gave me an idea for a question which I think I'd find quite interesting. Let's say you're not a Russian client nation, or rather you could be, or you could be an American client nation, or any nation would. Let's pick a origin. Shall we call it Argentina, Origin, Oristasian? Origin. Let's go with Origin. Let's say you're the country of Origin. I don't think there is one like that. You know what? If there is, I have really mucked up my geography. And you want to develop a naval aviation capability. Now, whilst budget is no real limit, you have found yourself in possession of incredibly useful uranium deposits and other things. You are enough of a nation in terms of naval presence and naval requirements that you realise that your infrastructure and everything needs to be developed. And you decide you want to have a carrier arm to defend your sea lines and communication, because whilst you can export things like oil and uranium, you have no real ability to import things like no real ability to do anything but import things like foodstuffs, etc., and all the other stuff you need for your economy. So how would you go about building up your naval aviation capability? What do you start with? What would you start with? So, you might have noticed the bookshelves have gone up. There are more bookshelves coming this week. They're going to arrive on Friday. And they're going to fill out some of the bookshelves down here, but also some more upstairs. Because I'm slowly basically sticking bookshelves up in both places and slowly getting books out of boxes and putting them in both places. Slowly. He says slowly. And yeah, thank you for your support and kindness. This channel would be nowhere without your support and your kindness. And I certainly won't be able to with the bills I'm paying out in the house. I managed to get all my books out of boxes, as much as I have now. Currently, down here, I have, in this pile, 12 boxes still left unopened. And that pile, I have actually counted them. It's 40 boxes unopened. And I have about another 28 unopened upstairs. But I'm slowly getting through them, thanks to you, and thanks to your kindness. So thank you everyone who's been donating to support that. There are more things coming up soon, and there's going to be some interesting surprises as November goes on. So thank you, and also The Patreon vote is still live and open, so people's votes still count and still can add up. Remember, as a rule, I'm aiming to do 2 premieres and 2 basically, to top 2 get turned into a Naval History Live and a Long Patrol. The next 2 down get turned into premieres. So that basically means the top 4 for votes will be done. Which means it matters going and voting, because often the top one, number 1 is a clear winner and it's very easy. But often there is fights for 2, 3, 4. Which one they're going to be, whether they're going to get a live or a live and a long patrol, a live and a recorded video, or just a premiere. And getting a difference between 4 and 5 can be not that far. So if you want to get it into this category, these votes matter, and you can vote for as many as you like. Okay, thank you very much for your support and your kindness and your help. And what else we got coming up? Now, next week, as I've kind of mentioned, we've got Soviet naval aviation. And then after that, we've got the Charles de Gaulle. And then French and other nations, World War II carrier naval aviation doctrine. There is a reason I called it Soviet naval aviation rather than Soviet naval aviation doctrine, etc. I'm calling it Soviet naval aviation because we're going to work through what that was like. This should be a fun video. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.